We've had a lot of cold weather here in Middle Tennessee, getting really, I would say, abnormally cold once again for the third year in a row, approaching 0 Fahrenheit. So that's below freezing Celsius, obviously. And it's time for an update on the broadleaf evergreens, because that is the category of tree that is most susceptible to cold damage. But before we dive into the broadleaves, I will quickly mention the conifers. I looked at all the conifers and there hasn't really been any damage, and there's really nothing new to see with them now, so I'll probably do a conifer update in the spring once they've started to break bud, and we can take a look at how they're going to grow. But back to the broadleafs. This is a Turnstoremia gymnanthera. This is the Liane cultivar, and it seems to have held up very well. And as I mentioned in maybe a previous video, the reaction to winter sun, cold and sun, looks like turning red, which is just fine because obviously these leaves are still alive. They're still green on the underside, so that'll green back up in the spring. This is the boxleaf honeysuckle, Lonicera nitida, holding up pretty well. I would say it definitely is evergreen. This is a low-growing shrub. And the Elaeagnus pungens, otherwise known as a silverthorn, had a little bit of browning on a few leaves, but overall still looking good, and I'm sure it will bounce back in the summer. This is the red bay tree, Persea borbonia. Doesn't look like it had any problems dealing with extreme cold. Here's the China Boy holly, which is a cross between Ilex rugosa and Ilex cornuta. Both of those are Eastern Asian species of holly, and it held up very well to the cold. Here we have Chinese holly, Ilex chinensis, also held up very well. And right next to that, another hybrid holly. This is the Screenplay, is the cultivar name, but it is a hybrid between Ilex latifolia and Ilex integra, and it looks like it did pretty good. Here we have the American holly, Ilex opaca, one of the most cold hardy hollies that you can grow, so obviously no damage whatsoever after the prolonged cold. And next to that we have another hybrid Chinese holly. Actually, it's hybrid European and Chinese holly. This is the Dragon Lady holly, which is a cross between Ilex perni and Ilex aquifolium. So looking pretty good. I think I detect the slightest browning maybe on some of the sun-facing leaves, but nothing serious, obviously. Did very well. And then the Oakland holly, which I believe also is some mixture of Chinese species, although I don't really remember which one this one is. I think it may have actually Ilex perni and Ilex cornuta mixed in there somehow. So no problems there, even on the exposed upper leaves here. You can see where I trimmed that back to thicken the growth a little bit. And then continuing with hollies, this is a hybrid North American holly, which is Ilex opaca combined with Ilex cassine, and that is the Foster's holly. So looks very good here. And keep in mind that all of these hollies, we're looking at these in pretty much the last day of January 2025. This is the Dahoon holly, Ilex cassine, and looking very good, even though its native range is in the deep south. Even the most tender upper shoots of leaves here did not seem to have any problems. Well, maybe there's one brown one there, but that's pretty minor. I guess a few of these delicate ones that sprouted late in the fall were not fully cold hardened, but for the most part the upper tips are just fine, and obviously the hardened lower growth is just fine as well. Actually, some of the interior growth looks like it did take cold damage here. I think I've seen that on a few hollies before, where sometimes the interior growth is not as cold hardy. Maybe the tree was going to weaken and lose those leaves anyway because of the shading. So minimal damage on the Dahoon holly. Let's keep going with hollies. Here we have the inkberry holly, Ilex glabra. No real problems. As expected, this is a very cold hardy holly. And this is the Japanese holly, Ilex crenata. This cultivar is the Steeds cultivar, in case you're wondering. It has a pretty normal branching structure, I'd say. Nothing really weird or columnar on this one. And so it did very well. No problem with Japanese holly. Finally, something that's not a holly. This is the Carolina laurel, Prunus caroliniana, and native to southeastern U.S., as you might imagine. Overall, looks pretty good. I mean, there's a little bit of orange on some of the interior leaves. It's hard to tell whether that's cold or looks more like fungus given the pattern, so I guess there's some sort of rust that minorly affects this tree, but it's nothing major, and it will of course take off growing again in the summertime, so I'm not at all worried about that. Carolina laurel is a great broadleaf evergreen for Middle Tennessee. And this is the southern wax myrtle, Myrica cerifera, and it for the third year in a row has taken some major damage to the foliage, as you can see by all this brown, although there's still some green left in here, well, a little green. It may end up losing all or most of these leaves and then put out new growth, but it's done that twice already since I've had it, because we've just had these abnormally cold Arctic blasts that come through, and some of the foliage looks worse than others. I think it may be trimming some branches on its own, self-pruning. But I've kept it sort of compact by pruning it to try to keep it from getting too lanky, because I'm worried about ice storm damage on it. And so far we haven't had an ice storm, but there has been pretty extreme cold for several winters that have damaged the foliage. But it's a very fast-growing broadleaf evergreen, and it usually recovers every summer. Back into holly country here. This is the Nellie Stevens holly, the combination of the Ilex cornuta and Ilex aquifolium that you see growing pretty much everywhere. The very upper reaches of this branch that I was trying to cultivate as the new main leader were damaged by the cold, but I'm guessing one of these smaller buds can take over and keep growing vertically in the springtime. Next to that we have the Savannah holly, which is yet another hybrid between Ilex opaca and Ilex cassine, both North American hollies, and for that reason there's really no cold damage whatsoever. They're both very cold hardy. This is the, I think it's Blue Prince holly, or maybe Blue Maid, one of the two. It's another what they call blue holly combination Ilex aquifolium and Ilex rugosa, and there's maybe the slightest bit of winter bronzing on some of the upper leaves here, but for the most part the tree looks pretty good. Let's focus that, there we go. Yeah, a little bronzing, not bad overall. And here's a relatively small specimen, Ilex spinigera, the Caspian holly, native to, I believe, the southern Caucasus Mountains and maybe even northern Iran along the Caspian Sea. So it's doing pretty good here. And this one is a pleasant surprise. I was a little worried about this holly here. It is Ilex coriaceae, the gallberry holly, native to pretty much the deep south, extreme deep south actually, and I was worried that because of its native range that it would not survive the cold, but of all the hollies this one is one of the ones that has the least damage shown on it at all, so definitely recommend Ilex coriaceae. I believe I got this from Woodlanders, and it doesn't look like a holly. It has kind of a wider leaf than a lot of other hollies, obviously minimal spines. I guess maybe it has a little bit of serration on some of the leaves, but what a cool holly. This one unfortunately has 2 leaders, so I'll have to get rid of one, but I bet it'll branch out more later on. Would you believe it? Another holly. This is the Yupon holly, Ilex vomitoria, also native to the southeastern U.S. Very small leaves, but didn't really take any damage, so I think it's doing pretty good. I do recommend Yupon holly. And here's a holly that's been damaged for the past 2 winters, but it looks like it may have survived the cold this winter. It is the Liberty holly, which is a hybrid between Ilex cornuta, Ilex perennii, and Ilex latifolia. All 3 of those are Chinese hollies. Now, this is probably one of the least cold hardy hollies in my holly collection, but it made it through the 7-degree Fahrenheit temperature this winter. So that's good news. Can finally make some progress on this during the next growing season. Here's a southern magnolia, Magnolia grandiflora. This is the Edith Bogue cultivar, and it did once again put on really good growth this growing season, probably about 2 feet vertical, and just the same as last year at the end of the growing season, the upper leaves began to be affected by the Phylosticta leaf blight, but I'm hopeful that it will repeat what it did last summer and just take off growing and pretty much outgrow the blight during the summer growing season. Seems like the blight is more of a cosmetic nuisance than a real threat to the tree's viability and survival. So I'm hoping that as it gets taller and gets more sunlight, more wind exposure, that will keep the foliage a little bit drier and over time minimize the impact of the Phylosticta. Hopefully. This is Euonymus Chialchovicus, the Manhattan Euonymus, and made it through the cold pretty well. It was really just planted kind of late in the season anyway, so it's a very tough plant in general, and I've seen plenty of examples around Middle Tennessee of this tree surviving below zero temperatures. Below 0 Fahrenheit, I should say. So down to -20 Celsius, in case you're wondering. So very hardy Euonymus, maybe one of the most hardy Euonymus trees that you can grow. Tree is kind of a, in quotation marks, whenever you see it, it's usually more of a bush, but I'm going to try to grow it as a tree. We'll see how that goes. Here's a different cultivar of southern magnolia. This is the D.D. Blanchard cultivar of Magnolia grandiflora. No winter damage there. And this is the Little Jim cultivar, also Magnolia grandiflora. And the only thing I can say about winter damage is that it was trying to put on some very late season blooms, and those were killed. And there were a few light breaking leaves here, I think November maybe, which were killed by the cold as well, which is to be expected. I don't know why it was putting off such late growth, but any of the growth that had already hardened from the summer, as you can see, is completely unaffected by the cold. Here we have Fetterbush. The Latin name is Leonia lucida, and this is another evergreen in the blueberry family, Ericaceae. It may have had a little bit of winter burn here at the tips, but mostly the leaves look decently green still. And here we have the Japanese Camellia japonica, looking pretty good here. And even though some of these same species of tree were frozen back to the ground when it got below zero, for the past 2 years they haven't really had a problem. So this one I just put in the ground, and I'm guessing that it should be good for the long haul, for the long term. And if it does happen to freeze back to the ground, it'll just resprout new shoots, as I have seen around town. And here we have the leatherwood tree, Cyrilla racemiflora. It is considered to be semi-evergreen. It did lose some leaves in the fall, but kept some green, and it looks like as a result of the cold, some of those that it kept were slightly damaged. Actually, it looks a little worse over here, although others seem to be not damaged. So kind of mixed results on the Cyrilla, but I do know that it has the capacity to lose all of its leaves and resprout new growth in the spring, which I'm guessing it will do that. Here, this one little lower branch has no damage whatsoever. Take a look at that. Hard to stay focused there. This is a pretty small specimen overall. I kind of have it protected by some buckets full of dirt that I was going to use for something else, and I figured maybe get a little insulation during the winter, and I don't know if it needed that or not, but we'll see. I'm still experimenting a little bit with this species, but I think it's a fairly robust species. It has an incredibly wide range in its natural habitat, actually stretching down to South America, unbelievably. But some of the sources I read about online say that it can actually survive in Zone 6, so we'll see. This is very experimental, but mixed results so far on Cyrilla racemiflora. And here's a broadleaf evergreen closely related to the southern wax myrtle, which is the bayberry, Myrica heterophylla, and it looks like its leaves are a lot more cold tolerant than the southern wax myrtle. I guess another name for this may be Myrica pennsylvanica. I'm not exactly sure if there's a difference between those two species, but it does grow in a more northerly region, and as you can see, the leaves are a little bit wider and probably even thicker than on the southern wax myrtle. I often forget about the fact that I have this tree tucked away in a partial shade location, but it did do pretty well with the cold. There was some death on the extreme small leaves there, but most of the hardened foliage looks pretty good and notably better than the Myrica cerifera. Here is one of two Daphne-phyllum macropotums that I have, and this one suffered the worst from the cold, and really I think more so sun scorch, because it was cold and sunny, no snow cover for a long time, and I think that just scorched the leaves, because actually if I look on the shady side of the tree, the foliage looks a lot better back here. So I think sun scorch is a real problem, at least with this very small specimen. And it wasn't really in the ground that long to begin with, so maybe the root structure wasn't as good and it wasn't able to muster as much resistance to the winter sun. But I did plant this one in an area that gets half-day sun, I would say, maybe more than half-day. Just for the sake of variety, I have another one I'll show you later in the shade, and it looks a lot better. Here's another Turnstroemia gymnanthera. This is the Bigfoot cultivar, and this one is in a more sunny location. It's got a little bit of purple, which I'm assuming is kind of like winter bronzing for the species. I don't know if it's blight or not. A little splotchy purple on the leaves, but overall survived very well. This is Osmanthus heterophylla, another broadleaf evergreen native to Eastern Asia. And this particular cultivar is the Sasaba, so that's why it has these very spiky leaves. There's a couple different configurations of Osmanthus heterophylla, but it is the most cold hardy Osmanthus. This is a sweetbay magnolia, Magnolia virginiana. I believe this is the Moonlight cultivar, not 100% sure on that, but looks like there was a little bit of browning on some leaves, but for the most part it kept a lot of leaves in the extreme cold. Here we have the Leucothui axillaris, coastal dog hobble, a relatively low-growing broadleaf evergreen native to Florida and the southeast, and it doesn't look like it had any problem whatsoever with the extreme cold, so very cold hardy on Leucothui axillaris. And then next to that I have the wheel tree, Trocodendron aurelioides. This one has survived some extreme temperatures. Last time it got really cold, it lost all its leaves, but this time it wasn't cold enough to even make it lose leaves or even turn brown, really. So it's in a mostly shady location here, so pretty well protected, and Trocodendron looking pretty good. Right next to that, we have another sweetbag magnolia here. This one is the Silver Mist cultivar, I believe. And the only thing I can point out about this one is that the leaves, or the branches, I should say, were weighted down by the snow, and it's sort of drooping and sagging, maybe hard to tell, but I'm hoping that it will pop back up and the leaves won't be falling down as much. And you can see they're actually falling down on top of another holly. This is another inkberry holly, Ilex glabra. This is the Densa cultivar, and once again a little purple splotchiness. Not sure if that's some sort of waterborne leaf blight, but not worried about it at all. It definitely survived from a cold hardiness perspective. And this is mountain laurel, Kalmia latifolia, and it is native to Middle Tennessee, actually, so there's no question about its cold hardiness here. And this is the Minuet cultivar, which has grown very slowly over the years, but still hanging in there, so I'm gonna keep it there as long as it'll survive. And next to that is the Florida anise, Elysium floridanum, native to Florida and other parts of the Deep South. And no real problem here, maybe the slightest bit of leaf scorch or blight on a few of the leaves, but for the most part, looking pretty good, and it handled the cold with no problem. The buds look ready to go in the springtime. And the Ocala anise, also native to Florida, Elysium parviflorum, looks basically flawless, as expected. Talk about more about that later when we get to the bigger specimen, but if you're not growing Elysium parviflorum in Tennessee and you want to grow a broadleaf evergreen, you should consider this one. Down here we have the Pieris japonica, otherwise known as Andromeda, and it's a member of the Ericaceae family, I believe, so related to blueberries, but this one doesn't really make blueberries. Very cold hardy, and no real damage. I came back and looked at this during the extreme cold, and I thought, since the leaves were drooping, that it might actually have damage, but the leaves perked right back up when the temperature came back above freezing, and it looks great. This was my marlberry, Ardisia japonica, completely killed by the extreme cold, so I will rip that out. As I mentioned in the previous video, it was somewhat experimental, and the experiment confirmed that you cannot grow Ardisia in Middle Tennessee. In contrast, this is the Alyssium henryi, a Chinese form of Alyssium, or anise tree, which was planted in December and then a few weeks later subjected to 7 degrees Fahrenheit. So you would think, man, that might take some damage. It did not take any damage whatsoever. Well, maybe there's the slightest browning on that one leaf, but overall looks good, really good. And I should add about this particular Alyssium specimen, it's pretty small, and it's in a mostly shady location, northern exposure to extreme drying winds, and it still didn't take any damage. So the whole Alyssium genus apparently is very tough. Here's another Elaeagnus pungens silverthorn, which also was in a very windy exposed location, and it looks great. I don't really see any damage. So silverthorn doing very well. And next to that we have the English laurel, Prunus laurocerasus. And it looks like the tip of it there was burned back, but the lower foliage was hard enough to resist the cold. And then right over here we have the devilwood tree, Cartrema americana, native to the southeastern U.S. And also, again, I'll remind you, planted in a very exposed, windy, mostly shade location, partial shade really here. And it looks like there's the slightest bit of scorching on some of the leaves, but not enough to really impact the growth of the tree. Here we have a relatively small specimen of Leucothoe fontanesiana, another low-growing evergreen, and it customarily does turn purple in the winter, so that's pretty normal. But it looks like even the smaller leaves survive the cold on this pretty much all-shade north-facing location. And next to that we have a rhododendron. I'm not sure which kind of rhododendron, and it has mixed results every now and then, but it looks like it came through the cold with no problems as well. Here's another wheel tree, Trocodendron aurelioides, with slightly more sun-facing exposure, and so it looks like there's a little winter scorch. So if you are going to grow Trocodendron and you don't want to risk winter scorch, I would say provide it with plenty of shade. After the extreme cold, it doesn't look like there's any damage at all on the Pyracantha, firethorn. Even the smallest leaves at the tip look like they didn't take any damage whatsoever. And this is a fairly lanky and tall specimen here. I would say partial sun is the planting situation, and looks like it made it through just fine. This one was killed when the temperature dropped below 0 Fahrenheit, and that's again around -20 Celsius. The tree was frozen back to the ground essentially, but it has resprouted since the December of dieback of 2022, and during the growing season of 2023 and 2024 it went from the ground to being 6 feet tall. So it does put on 3 feet vertical growth per year, although extremely lanky and see-through, so keep that in mind. I'm probably going to try to limit the height of it this year to let it fill in a little bit and establish some more strength, because I'm a little worried that the wood might not be strong enough to withstand an ice event. And here's another Bigfoot Clayera, Turnstromia geminanthera, with a partial shade situation, and the foliage looks just a little bit better, but there's still some purple splotchiness and maybe some burning at the extreme tips here. So Clayera held up pretty well when the temperature approached 0, but didn't actually go below it. And here's my other Daphne-phyllum macropodum. You'll remember the other one had some pretty bad leaf scorch in the sun. This one is partial sun, and it doesn't have any problems whatsoever. So once again, reinforcing the cold hardiness credentials of the Daphne-phyllum macropodum, but it does prefer some shade in the winter to avoid scorch. I should also say it's a protected location, so there's not as much strong wind here either. Florida hobblebush or featherbush. There's many different common names, but the Latin name is Agarista populifolia, native to the southeastern U.S., and also a member of the blueberry family, I believe. But looks like it's extremely cold hardy. I don't see the slightest bit of problem with even the smallest leaves at the tip. So thumbs up for Agarista. This is a barberry, Berberis replicata. I believe it's native to China, and it also withstood the cold pretty well. Maybe just a little bit of bronzing on some of the upper leaves, but Berberis replicata survived pretty good. This is the Castle Wall holly. I believe this may be a hybrid between Ilex rugosa and something else. Not sure what else. But the rugosa heritage means that it's going to be extremely cold hardy. And just a little bit of information here. The Ilex rugosa is a holly native to northern Japan and even extreme far eastern Russia that is a very small, low-growing montane or mountainous region growing holly, and never really gets too far from the ground in its growing environment. But over the years it's been hybridized with other hollies that do grow in more of a vertical growing pattern just to convey that cold resistance. But it also usually makes the leaves a little bit smaller and darker. This is a viburnum, Prague viburnum, which is also a hybrid between two species of viburnum native to China, the Ilex utili and Ilex rhytidophyllum. And I believe it's more cold hardy than the straight species Ilex rhytidophyllum, which is the leatherleaf viburnum. And actually, I'm going to try to get a picture of it, but I think I saw some scorching on the leatherleaf viburnum. But this one has a little bit of winter bronzing, or more like purple coloration. You can see there on the most exposed leaves, it almost looks like a purple highlight, but it's actually a change in the color of the leaf in response to the winter scorch. And different species of plants do this. They turn a little bit purple or red in the winter, and those are the anthocyanins in the leaf protecting it from the UV radiation and the cold. So nothing abnormal there. Viburnum, the Prague viburnum, I should say, survives very cold temperatures, and this one was actually in the ground during the extreme cold event a couple years ago and survived fairly well. So Prague viburnum is a great choice for a broadleaf evergreen. And here's another pyracantha, firethorn. I believe this one is the Yukon Bell cultivar. The other one I think may have been Teton. And the only real impact of the cold is the leaves turning red at the tip, for the reason I just told you about, a reaction to the cold and sunlight in the winter. But no cold damage, it looks like, in terms of cellular structure damage. It seems like it's just reacting to the cold. Next to that we have the Portuguese laurel, looking pretty good, although if you look closely you can see that the most tender growth at the tips was scorched. In almost every case, really. It's amazingly consistent on every branch. But the inner, more hardened foliage held up very well. Still a nice bright green here in the last week of January. And this is the Centennial Girl Holly, which I believe is a hybrid between Ilex equifolium and Ilex centrochinensis. And this is a relatively slow-growing holly, also in the category of blue hollies. And it's just a kind of nice, compact, dark green holly. It was frozen back to the ground when it reached really cold temperatures a couple years ago, and it's since regrown in that time to be about approaching 3 feet tall. So not that fast of a grower, but actually looking really good. And for the past 2 winters, when it has approached 0 but not gone below it, it was able to survive that with no problem. And now we finally get to the granddaddy of them all, the ultimate in cold hardiness and really everything hardiness in terms of broadleaf evergreen. I mentioned it before, the Ocala anise, Elysium parviflorum. Once again, came through the cold with flying colors. Not the slightest indication of damage anywhere, really, unless maybe these interior branches. I don't know if that's blight or what. It looks more like blight. based on the pattern. Probably not cold damage. I do have a little bit of work to do on this one. Actually, this summer, I'm going to have to pick which branch I want to continue as the main trunk. You can see I've been letting it grow with a couple different trunks here while it was getting established. And this is a damaged spot right here that happened when they weed eated the tree. I don't know how or why, but the weed eating people are pretty careless. And so I'm going to maybe remove that branch and maybe even this back one as well, and let this be the new main trunk, and then just continue that process so that this Alyssium is more of a tree form and not so much a bush. And now I'm just removing some rocks away from the base here because I want to make sure that the trunk has room to grow. And I'll go back and do that more thoroughly later. But if you do use rock mulch, one thing of continual maintenance may be over the years just to make sure that you remove rocks from around the base of the tree and you're not strangling it with a bunch of immovable rocks. It doesn't look like there's been any damage to the trunk here so far, which is good. Let's take a look here. And looking pretty good, I'd say. I don't really see any major damage or any damage at all, really. So probably it would be able to push the rocks away if it really had to. I don't know, they're pretty wedged in here. But I'll make sure it has plenty of space to keep growing. Well, that is a vivid green algae on that white rock there. Just noticed that. But yeah, I will have to take away some of these side branches because I don't want it to be a bush. And look at this branch here that goes up and then curves and comes back down. I'll definitely get rid of that. And maybe trim this a lot as well here, this little vertical. Don't need that. I'm going to keep this one back here though and trace that all the way up, which I believe actually is connected to the highest vertical up here, luckily. So the strongest base branch in this case did translate into the highest vertical. And over the years, I'm hoping that with a little bit of pruning, anyway, with a little bit of pruning, I should be able to convince the tree to put on more side growth and thicken up a little bit so that it will be basically pyramidal in shape is the ultimate goal. Kind of wide at the base and then getting narrower towards the top so that the tree can get sunlight to all of the foliage. That's the overall plan. I do not want it to end up being a giant bush, so I'm going to have to do the same process for all the other Alyssiums that I have, and really all the other broadleaf evergreens in general, to make sure they're constantly growing vertical with a single trunk, because I am growing for height and size, and I think that allowing a tree to grow as a bush with multiple trunks just weakens it and spreads the growth out horizontally, and I want to keep things growing vertical and keep all of the energy focused upward on my broadleaf evergreens. So a little bit of work to do on this one. As you can see now, it is pretty bushy, but I'm going to change that this summer and see if the Alyssium responds well to selective pruning.